a self-centered worldview does not have place for commitments that do not serve immediate goals. The structural impact on the global order of these developments are likely to be visible over the next generation. That would have many dimensions, each one of them itself a factor of disruption. The most obvious one is that the world will be increasingly more multipolar as distribution of power broadens and alliance discipline dilutes. And India or a Brazil will demand a greater voice with a growing economy. A Germany and a Japan cannot be impervious to changes in American thinking. The reality is that the space yielded by the West has been filled by many players, not just China. Furthermore, both the US and China have a use for third parties, and the politics of the day will drive multipolarity even faster. The beneficiaries will be the G20 powers and those at that level. Powers who already have prior advantages like Russia, France, and UK will probably get a fresh impetus. Some, like India, can aspire to an improved position. Others, like Germany, could increase their weight through collective endeavors. But this would also be a world of a Brazil or a Japan, of a Turkey or an Iran, a Saudi Arabia or an Australia, each having a greater say in their vicinity and perhaps even beyond. There is a reason why going up the global hierarchy is judged by the ability to successfully manage conflicting priorities. So in this different era, there will be convergence with many, but congruence with none. Finding common points to engage with as many power centers will characterize diplomacy at its highest level. For this reason, India will find it perfectly natural to engage a Chinese leader at Wuhan, a Russian one at Sochi, and then go on to a 2+2 meeting of foreign and defense ministers of the United States. I mean, there is today a sharp sense of the neighborhood. When you keep saying neighborhood first, there is a message in it for all the neighbors. When it comes to ASEAN, the emphasis on the act versus the look, again, has a message of greater engagement. The Indian Ocean has a policy called Sagar, which again is a much more integrated, I mean actually for the first time an integrated Indian Ocean strategy from Australia to Madagascar. And the Indo-Pacific is again an example of a willingness to go beyond traditional silos and accept that the world today is much more seamless than it used to be. You know, we have fairly clear principles on connectivity. I mean, we feel connectivity should be sort of consultative process. They should be sort of have viability in market economy terms. That they should be locally, there should be a sense of local ownership. They should respond to all of that. And I mean, that's our view. If others have different views, I mean, that's their privilege. What we have done in the last many years is actually to put that to work. Today, we would have a very large number of connectivity projects across South Asia. South Asia is our first sort of circle of priority because we are very conscious it's a very under-integrated region. So what we have tried to do through soft loans, through grants, through encouraging business collaborations, really look to see if we can get much greater common connectivity on power transmission, on data flows, on optical fiber networks, on roads, on waterways, on rail links. The different era which we have entered also calls for both India and the United States to press the refresh button of their relationship. The really important relationships in the world are the less transactional ones. They are driven by global assessments and are based on strengthening each other. They visualize even in the uncertainties of a more volatile era, new opportunities for cooperation. Recent events in our ties confirm that the deep convergences developed over the last 2 decades are now in full play. I'm confident that a strategic appreciation of the emerging global landscape would only bring us closer. For India as a neighbor with a somewhat complicated history, I think the search for us is for an equilibrium that would be satisfactory on both sides. It's not easy, an easy exercise, but to my mind it is a very, very necessary exercise, because it's in the interest of neither country nor indeed the rest of the world that India-China relations are anything other than stable. We made some creative attempts at that. 2 years ago at Astana, there was a understanding, 2 conceptual understanding. One, that really our relation should be a factor of stability in an uncertain world, and 2, that differences should not become disputes. Today India and China have conversations at the leadership level with a degree of candor and an openness which they've not had for a very, very long time. And that, to my mind, has an enormous value, because when you are searching for an equilibrium, unless you have those conversations, you will not get to that equilibrium. The Japanese relationship is another important relationship. We've really come a very long way with Japan. We see Japan today economically active in India in a manner in which it has not been before. They've also brought to bear a much more strategic view of Asia and our part of Asia in particular. And we've expanded our relationship today to cover security issues, and those of you who have dealt with Japan would really understand, what it takes to actually get there. We have begun, in a way, a much greater focus on Africa. It's interesting today, 5 years ago, we had, 4 years ago at the India-Africa Summit, committed to $10 billion of lines of credit and $600 million of grant assistance to Africa. We are on track to actually deliver on that and perhaps exceed that in the 5-year period. We had also a training target of 50,000 for 5 years. We've actually done 40. We are opening 18 new embassies in the 3 years. All 18 are going to be in Africa. Institutions themselves, look at the United Nations. Obviously we are biased. We believe we have a good case, but if you have, maybe in 15 years, you would have a United Nations where the most populous country in the world, with the 3rd largest economy, is not in the decision making of the United Nations.
Yeah, right.
I grant you it affects the country concerned, but I would also suggest it affects the United Nations credibility. And it's not just the Security Council. The centrality of the United Nations to international relations and the WTO to international trade must be recognized, preserved, and protected. Adherence to international law is also critical. But if regimes and institutions are to be credible, they must be contemporary. One part of it is how do you build bridges, and there the role of the diaspora would be very important. But increasingly what we can see is that the treatment of the diaspora abroad becomes a factor in India's responses to a particular country or society. So I see that really not just as a conversation between India and its diaspora, but also a factor in our relations with other countries and other partners. Now, and in a sense, that's a two-way factor, because the diaspora also relates to, particularly the Indian diaspora relates much more to development in home country than many other diasporas do. So if you were to ask me, so how is India going to grow? Would it be manufacturing? Would it be services? Would it be startups? Would it be skills? Would it be exports? Would it be, globalized, talent-driven? Would it be insular? My answer would be all of the above, because I think we'll kind of end up in that situation. And that kind of India and this much more differentiated, complex West, their coming together to me is really a proposition which is very desirable. So, in fact, my own sense is globalization is there to stay. You can modulate it, you can alter it here and there, but fundamentally the idea that in this day and age economies would be primarily national, I think is a very mobility should not be allowed, or that interpenetration of economies can be controlled. I mean, all those, I think there are realities out there. But the point I was making was, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even argued over this point, because everybody more or less accepted this is the direction the world is moving. Today we are arguing over that point. And I mean, whichever side of the argument I am on, I cannot be in denial of the fact that there is an argument, and I have to factor it into my calculations. But to the extent we can define it within sharper boundaries, they probably are best captured by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the world seeks to achieve today. These range from ending poverty and hunger, securing education, health and employment, achieving gender and income equality, combating climate change, and adopting an environmentally friendly lifestyle, adapting our consumption and production habits accordingly, and undertaking domestic and global partnerships for sustainable development. In fact, each of these themes is reflected in Gandhiji's writings, advocacy, and example. He was truly a figure ahead of his times, and the relevance of his teachings have only grown in the modern era. If the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi got such a resounding mandate from the people at the 2019 elections, it is in large part due to the effective delivery on the ground of socio-economic services and benefits that are very much in consonance with this approach. Indeed, the national campaigns of the Modi government capture the essence of the SDGs fully, whether it is Swachh Bharat, Clean India, Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, which is educate and empower your daughter, Ayushman Bharat, which is healthy India, Jan Dhan Yojana, which is financial inclusion, Namami Gange, the cleaning of rivers, smart cities, digital India, skill India, and startup India. Look at where we were on August 5th. After 70 years, after the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, and about 30 years of what has been a fairly high-intensity cross-border terrorism waged, which has disrupted pretty much the fabric of the state. There were limits to how much you could progress out there, because particularly the last few years you had a lot of new elements to the challenges out there, including the emergence of much more radical fundamentalist ideologies and people bearing weapons in that name. You also had actually a social and if I were to give you a little history here, it's very interesting. Just so that I have you all on the same page. Article 370, the temporary Article 370, provided for the issue of presidential proclamations by which national laws then became applicable to the state. Now, in fact, if you look at the representative sample of any legislation which was passed by the parliament, fairly high up, page 1, maybe para 2 or para 3 you would have, but this law applies to all of India except to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So I would surely, from a common sense point of view, if you are, in a day and age where every society is undergoing change, hopefully for the better, the idea that one state remains unaligned, that every time it has to do its own thing, which it didn't do a lot of it. I mean, if they were doing it on their own and keeping in step, it was a different matter. But you look pretty much at anything progressive, anything to do with women, anything to do with children, anything to do with property, anything to do with affirmative action. I mean, in fact, the irony, Devesh, is everything which the liberal press thinks is good for the world was not happening in Jammu and Kashmir. And yet people wanted to defend the provision which was blocking that good from happening. I mean, look at the absurdity of it.